Hello and welcome. I finally have my hands on the Steam Deck and I'm very excited. I've been spending quite a bit of time installing and testing a number of games. The first game I wanted to get on here was Final Fantasy XIV, but the idea of a portable Final Fantasy in general always seemed amazing to me. In fact, 10 years ago in 2012, I had this baby here, the PlayStation Vita, in which I was able to play the first 10 Final Fantasies on here. And so 10 years later, now we have the Steam Deck. For those who aren't aware, all 15 mainline Final Fantasies are on Steam, and today I wanted to go through every single one and do a little bit of a quick check through all of them. Now, Valve has their own verification system, in which they are able to designate a rating to each game they test. In Valve's words, as this work takes place, our existing standards for titles to get a verified or a playable rating are very high. If a game shows controller glyphs 99% of the time, but tells you to press F sometimes during the gameplay, that's playable, not verified. If 99% of the game's functionality is accessible, but accessing one optional in-game minigame crashes or one tutorial video doesn't render, that's unsupported. So this gives us an idea on how they give a rating to each game. So we can keep that in mind when we're going through each game. Currently, as of March 25th, 2022, these are the Final Fantasy games that are verified. As you can see, not a whole lot, but over time we'll probably see more in this category. These are the ones that are currently playable. As stated before in the quote, these are still 99% playable, but may have a hiccup here and there, but can still play on the Steam Deck. These are the games that are currently unsupported. Now, unsupported does not mean unplayable. A lot of these games are still playable, but may have an unexpected error, or in the case of Final Fantasy XIV, the launcher may not be compatible with Proton. We'll still go through each one and see how well they play anyway. And finally, these are the ones untested. Pretty self-explanatory. There's a ton of games on Steam, so it's not surprising that this early in the system's life cycle, there's going to be some Final Fantasies that still needs to be tested. And with that being said, let's get to the games. So let's start with the Pixel Remasters. Hilariously, this is probably going to be the closest we get to the console Pixel Remasters until they finally put it on the Switch. Probably as expected, all 6 of these games are very much playable and run with very little problems. The first 4 Final Fantasies are verified. The 5th one is the only one with a playable status rather than verified like the first 4. I ran into some massive slowdowns, especially when using dualcast, but for the most part, the game can run pretty well. The 6th game is currently untested, and the likely reason for that is because the 6th Pixel Remaster came out the same week as the Steam Deck launch, and so they probably didn't get a chance to test it out. But I imagine it'll get a verified or playable status like the first 5 anyway. Next, let's move on to the Final Fantasy III 3D Remake and the Final Fantasy IV 3D Remake. Final Fantasy III 3D Remake is rated playable. Final Fantasy IV 3D Remake is rated verified. Before we get into gameplay, I'm going to start by saying that a lot of these games will come with their own launcher, mainly for config purposes such as controls and graphic settings. Now, let's get into Final Fantasy III. We see that the game runs very smoothly at a constant 30 FPS, so there's really no complaints on the performance here. With Final Fantasy IV 3D Remake, however, this is where I feel as though I have to question the verified status. Downloading without any tweaks, the game itself launches without no music or sound effects, only voices. Yeah, there's no sound. I'm full, right? Yeah, I'm basically full. Okay, let me switch. However, with the help of ProtonDB, I was able to get the proper sounds back by forcing the game to run under Proton 4.11-13. This has me raising questions for the verified status, as without forcing compatibility, you'd be losing out on a key aspect of the game. I'm not sure why Final Fantasy IV 3D Remake ever got verified, but regardless, the game now runs smoothly and should have no problems afterwards. Now let's talk about Final Fantasy IV After Years. Unlike Final Fantasy IV 3D Remake, After Years works right out of the box and should have no problems playing through it. I have no idea why the original had problems and After Years doesn't, as they both have the same engine, but I'm not complaining. Now let's talk about Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VI mobile versions. Now, I understand that both of these games are unlisted now due to the Pixel Remaster versions, but let's go through them anyway. Final Fantasy V is at least tested to be unsupported, and Final Fantasy VI is just untested. Both of these games run perfectly fine, and if you still happen to own these, there should be no problems playing both. I would still recommend the Pixel Remasters due to the visuals alone, but the thing that is going for both of these is at least that they have the additional content that the Pixel Remasters do not have. Now, let's get to Final Fantasy VII, VIII, and IX. Final Fantasy VII and VIII are actually ports of the original that came out well before Steam existed, and so both are going to have quite a bit of problems on their own. Final Fantasy VII is labeled Playable, and it does seem like a good call. For the most part, it's still a good port of Final Fantasy VII. However, a lot of the game is meant for keyboard and mouse, and the inputs in-game are generic inputs. The game does support controllers, however, the community inputs seem better than the Steam default ones. To be clear, this version of Final Fantasy VIII is not the Final Fantasy VIII Remaster, but rather its own Final Fantasy VIII PC version. This version is still sold in the Steam store as of this recording. Final Fantasy VIII is labeled as unsupported. With the Final Fantasy VIII port, it is very much the same as Final Fantasy VII, although I found the music does not work with this version. Looking at ProtonDB again, there does seem to be a fix by downloading direct music and doing a little bit of tweaks to make it work. However, even if you get the music working, the music in this version is a very low quality version of the music anyway. Your best alternative is honestly just getting the Final Fantasy VIII Remaster version, as it offers a better version of the soundtrack and much better visuals overall. The remaster works like a charm on the Steam Deck. Final Fantasy IX is also labeled as unsupported, but unlike Final Fantasy VIII PC port, this version does not seem to have too many problems. There's already quite a bit of reports and videos on Final Fantasy IX working like a charm, so I really wouldn't worry too much about it. For me, the game runs really smoothly. Now, let's get to Final Fantasy X HD. Final Fantasy X HD is currently untested, but since the game has been on consoles, including the PS3, PS Vita, and Switch, among others, I'm not surprised that this game runs really well on the Steam Deck. There should be no problems playing this game. I'm getting a constant 30 FPS and there should be no performance issues playing it. Now, I'm going to be skipping Final Fantasy XI. We're going to be saving that for later. Let's move on to Final Fantasy XII real quick. Much like Final Fantasy X, 12 has been on other consoles as well, and so the remaster should work very well just like 10 HD. This is, however, the first one we can actually change the graphic settings, and so looking at high settings, it can hit 60 FPS, but it's not consistent. However, it will never go under 30 FPS. Going into medium seems to keep a steady 60 FPS. In any case, this game is a solid version of the game. Now let's get to the dreaded Final Fantasy XIII Trilogy. Just a bit of forewarning, the Steam versions of these games are very poor quality ports of the trilogy. They still suffer many problems even on Windows PCs. They have very poor consistency with frame rates and very limited resolution options. Right from the get-go, Final Fantasy XIII gave me a ton of frame drops in the first instance of gameplay, and it gave massive stutters. Final Fantasy XIII-2's gameplay also suffered from incredibly low frame rates, dropping into the single digits. With both games, however, there is a fix that can help with performance if you so choose. Lightning Returns is the better of the three games. There's still some stuttering here and there, but it's not as severe as the previous two games. If I'm gonna be honest, I'd rather wait for the Game Pass to be available on the Steam Deck, as they have a much superior version of the first two games. This is honestly the first games in this video that I will recommend against getting these and just playing them on Game Pass instead. Now on to Final Fantasy 15, and to be honest, after Final Fantasy 13's performances, this is a breath of fresh air. Final Fantasy 15's performance actually impressed me a lot. Running on medium settings gives me an average frame rate of between 40 and 60 FPS, although capping it to 30 just seems like a better way to go to preserve battery life. The game itself runs amazingly, and the gameplay is just smooth on the Steam Deck. I'm definitely looking forward to playing this more on my Steam Deck. Now, let's move on to the MMO Final Fantasies. Final Fantasy XI initially gave me some troubles with the Play Online launcher. The launcher just kept crashing on me. Luckily, I solved it by going into desktop mode, launching Final Fantasy XI, and Steam downloaded the rest of the files that enabled Play Online to work. After that, you should have no problems running Play Online on the gaming side of Steam OS. Getting into Final Fantasy XI, the Steam Deck may default to using mouse and keyboard settings, so you may need to go into the config and change the controls from there. Afterwards, you should be good to play Final Fantasy XI, and it works great. I think that this is something that I will be playing more, now that the portability is an option with this game, and I'm very excited. Now, I've seen some reports saying that WinDoor does work on Linux, however, it's very janky and may not work properly. If not having WinDoor is a make or break, I completely understand. It offers so many quality of life features. However, if playing vanilla doesn't bother you, I think this is a great way to enjoy Final Fantasy XI. Now, let's move on to Final Fantasy XIV. As we know from the IGN video and the Gabe Newell interview, we always knew that the game worked on the Steam Deck. However, the game is still rated unsupported. A bit of forewarning, if you have the Steam version as of March 25th, 2022, you will not be able to sign in, as the new launcher does not work with Proton. This will more than likely change, and there has been some talks that they are working on it. However, if you have the non-Steam version, you should be able to do a workaround that gets the game working for you. I will link that video I used to get into Final Fantasy XIV down in the description. As I said in the beginning, this is my main reason for getting the Steam Deck, and I'm very excited as I'm going to be spending a lot of my time playing Final Fantasy XIV on the Steam Deck. I'm definitely going to be doing a lot more casual things like crafting and gathering, and even dailies and relics seems amazing on a device like this. I've already gone through and did an entire Alliance dungeon and a raid night on stream using my Steam Deck. I've configured my controls and back pedals to my liking, and even got Discord and Spotify to work in the background while playing Final Fantasy XIV. I might do a separate video on 14 on this. Let me know in the comments if you want that. But for now, I'll just comment on the performance. For me, I've tested the game to laptop high, and it still gives me a decent frame rate. However, locking the frame rate to 30 and setting it down to laptop standard gives me a playtime of around 4 to 5 hours on a full battery. Most areas and dungeons gives a constant 60 FPS frame rate, and it really is only during the Alliance dungeons and in major cities that I see a drop in frame rate. Final Fantasy XIV is just an incredibly well optimized game. I'm just very glad this works fantastically on the Steam Deck. And with that, that is all the mainline Final Fantasies on Steam. However, we still have two other games on Steam, and those are World of Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy Type 0. Very quickly, World of Final Fantasy locks itself to 30 FPS, but the game runs great and looks fantastic. No complaints here. Now, Type 0 gave me some troubles. The first time running it, I ran into some problems where cutscenes were giving me a video test signal, much like the one you see on screen. Subsequent resets gave me a black screen. However, forcing the compatibility to Proton GE 7-10 makes the cutscenes work. The gameplay itself runs really well and gives me no problems. Now before we end, I wanted to talk about 3 more games that are not listed on Steam. First, let's take a look at Final Fantasy VII Remake. This is available on Epic Games and can be installed through the Heroic launcher. Despite it having stutters and some performance issues very much like on Windows, it still very much impresses me that the Steam Deck can even run a game like this. This is probably the most graphically intense game on this list, and aside from a few stutters, it actually runs really well. This game impresses me a lot, and this gives me hope about the Steam Deck's potential. The next game I tested was Final Fantasy Origins Stranger of Paradise. This new game release unfortunately crashes on me on launch. This isn't really surprising as this is a new game, however I can also comment that the game itself does not run well on Windows anyway, so it might be a while before the game even works on the Steam Deck. And finally, the last game I tested is actually emulated using PPSSPP. This is Final Fantasy Tactics. There is some weird audio popping, but the game itself works like a charm. Just the fact that emulation is possible and even encouraged on the Steam Deck just opens up so much more possibility on the device. I'm definitely looking forward to playing more games, not just Final Fantasy on this device. And with that, that is the end of my preliminary testing with Final Fantasy on the Steam Deck. I just think it's incredibly impressive that we're at a level now in gaming that we can play such a wide range of games on a handheld like the Steam Deck, and I'm very excited to see what the future has in store. Anyway, thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. It will always be appreciated. And I will see you in the next video.